The Black Abbot of Puthuum by Clark Ashton Smith. Zobal the archer and Cushara the pike-bearer had poured many a libation to their friendship in the sanguine liquors of Euros and the blood of the kingdom's enemies. In that long and lusty amity, broken only by such passing quarrels as concerned the division of a wineskin or the apportioning of a wench, they had served amid the soldiery of King Hoaraph for a strenuous decade. Savage warfare and wild, fantastic hazard had been their lot. The renown of their valor had drawn upon them, ultimately, the honor of Hoaraph's attention, and he had assigned them for duty among the picked warriors that guarded his palace in Farad, and sometimes the twain were sent together on such missions as required no common hardihood and no disputable fealty to the king. Now, in company with the eunuch Simban, chief purveyor to Hoaraph's well-replenished harem, Zobal and Cushara had gone on a tedious journey through the tract known as Isdrel, which clove the western part of Euros asunder with its rusty-colored wedge of desolation. The king had sent them to learn if haply there abode any verity in certain travellers' tales which concerned a young maiden of celestial beauty who had been seen among the pastoral peoples beyond Isdrel. Simban bore at his girdle a bag of gold coins with which, if the girl's pulchritude should be in any wise commensurate with the renown thereof, he was empowered to bargain for her purchase. The king had deemed that Zobal and Cushara should form an escort equal to all contingencies, for Isdrel was a land reputedly free of robbers, or indeed of any human inhabitants. Men said, however, that malign goblins, tall as giants, and humped like camels, had oftentimes beset the wayfarers through Isdrel, that fair but ill-meaning Lamia had lured them to an eldritch death. Simban, quaking corpulently in his saddle, rode with small willingness on that outward journey, but the archer and the pike-bearer, full of wholesome skepticism, divided their bawdy jests between the timid eunuch and the elusive demons. Without other mishap than the rupturing of a wineskin from the force of the new vintage it contained, they came to the verdurous pasture land beyond that dreary desert. Here, in low valleys that held the middle meanderings of the river Vas, cattle and dromedaries were kept by a tribe of herders who sent biannual tribute to Hoaraph from their teeming droves. Simban and his companions found the girl, who dwelt with her grandmother in a village beside the Vas, and even the eunuch acknowledged that their journey was well rewarded. Cushara and Zobal, on their part, were instantly smitten by the charms of the maiden, whose name was Rubalsa. She was slender and of queenly height, and her skin was pale as the petals of white poppies, and the undulant blackness of her heavy hair was full of sullen copper gleamings beneath the sun. While Simban haggled shrilly with the crone-like grandmother, the warriors eyed Rubalsa with circumspect ardor, and addressed to her with such gallantries as they deemed discreet within hearing of the eunuch. At last the bargain was driven, and the price paid, to the sore depletion of Simban's money-bag. Simban was now eager to return to Farad with his prize, and he seemed to have forgotten his fear of the haunted desert. Zobal and Cushara were routed from their dreams by the impatient eunuch before dawn, and the three departed with the still drowsy Rubalsa ere the village could awaken about them. Noon, with its sun of candent copper in a blackish-blue zenith, found them far amid the rusty sands and iron-toothed ridges of Isdrel. The route they followed was little more than a footpath, for though Isdrel was but 30 miles in width at that point, few travellers would dare those fiend-infested leagues, and most preferred an immensely circuitous road, used by the herders, that ran to the southward of that evil desolation, following the Vas nearly to its debouchment in the Indaskian Sea. Kushara, splendid in his plate armor of bronze, on a huge piebald mare with a cataphract of leather scaled with copper, led the cavalcade. Rubulsa, who wore the red homespun of the herders' women, followed on a black gelding with silk and silver harness, which Hoaraph had sent for her to use. Close behind her came the watchful eunuch, gorgeous in party-colored sendal, and mounted ponderously, with swollen saddlebags all about him, on the grey ass of uncertain age, which, through his fear of horses and camels, he insisted on riding at all times. In his hand he held the leading rope of another ass, which was nearly crushed to the ground by the wineskins, water jugs, and other provisions. Zobal guarded the rear, with unslung bow, slim and wiry in his suiting of light chainmail, on a nervous stallion that chaffed incessantly at the rein. At his back he bore a quiver filled with arrows, which the court sorcerer, Amdok, had prepared with singular spells and dippings in doubtful fluids for his possible use against demons. Zobal had accepted the arrows courteously, but had satisfied himself later that their iron barbs were in no wise impaired by Amdok's treatment. A similarly ensorcelled pike had been offered by Amdok to Kushara, who had refused it bluffly, saying that his own well-tried weapon was equal to the spitting of any number of devils. Because of Simban and the 2 asses, the party could make little speed. However, they hoped to cross the wilder and more desolate portion of Israel ere night. Simban, though he still eyed the dismal waste dubiously, was plainly more concerned with his precious charge than with the imagined imps and Lemie, and Kushara and Zobal, both wrapped in amorous reveries that centered about the luscious Rubulsa, gave only a perfunctory attention to their surroundings. The girl had ridden all morning in demure silence. Now, suddenly, she cried out in a voice whose sweetness was made shrill by alarm. The others reined their mounts, and Simban babbled questions. To these, Rubulsa replied by pointing toward the southern horizon, where, as her companions now saw, a peculiar pitch-black darkness had covered a great portion of the sky and hills, obliterating them wholly. This darkness, which seemed due neither to cloud nor sandstorm, extended itself in a crescent on either hand, and came swiftly toward the travelers. In the course of a minute or less, it had blotted the pathway before and behind them like a black mist, and the 2 arcs of shadow, racing northward, had flowed together, immuring the party in a circle. The darkness then became stationary, its walls no more than 100 feet away on every side. Sheer, impenetrable, it surrounded the wayfarers, leaving above them a clear space from which the sun still glared down, remote and small and discolored, as if seen from the bottom of a deep pit. "Aye, aye, aye!" howled Simban, cowering amid his saddlebags. "I knew well that some devilry would overtake us." At the same moment, the 2 asses began to bray loudly, and the horses, with a frantic neighing and squealing, trembled beneath their riders. Only with much cruel spurring could Zobal force his stallion forward beside Kushara's mare. "Mayhap it is only some pestilential mist," said Kushara. "Never have I seen such a mist," replied Zobal doubtfully, "and there are no vapors to be met with in Israel. Methinks it is like the smoke of the 7 hells that men fable beneath Zothik." "Shall we ride forward?" said Kushara. "I would learn whether or not a pike can penetrate that darkness." Calling out some words of reassurance to Rubulsa, the twain sought to spur their mounts toward the murky wall. But after a few swerving paces, the mare and the stallion balked wildly, sweating and snorting, and would go no farther. Kushara and Zobal dismounted and continued their advance on foot. Not knowing the source or nature of the phenomenon with which they had to deal, the 2 approached it warily. Zobal, knocked an arrow to a string, and Kushara held the great bronze-headed pike before him, as if charging an embattled foe. Both were more and more puzzled by the murkiness, which did not recede before them in the fashion of fog, but maintained its opacity when they were close upon it. Kushara was about to thrust his weapon into the wall. Then, without the least prelude, there arose in the darkness, seemingly just before him, a horrible multitudinous clamor, as of drums, trumpets, cymbals, jangling armor, jarring voices, and mailed feet that tramped to and fro on the stony ground with a mighty clangor. As Kushara and Zobal drew back in amazement, the clamor swelled and spread, till it filled with a babel of warlike noises the whole circle of mysterious night that hemmed in the travelers. "Verily, we are sore beset," shouted Kushara to his comrade as they went back to their horses. "It would seem that some king of the north has sent his myrmidons into Euros." "Yea," said Zobal, "but it is strange that we saw them not ere the darkness came, and the darkness, surely, is no natural thing." Before Kushara could make any rejoinder, the martial clashings and shoutings ceased abruptly. All about, it seemed that there was a rattling of innumerable sistra, a hissing of countless huge serpents, a raucous hooting of ill-omened birds that had foregathered by thousands. To these indescribably hideous sounds the horses now added a continual screaming, and the asses a more frenzied braying, above which the outcries of Rubalsa and Simban were scarce audible. Kushara and Zobal sought vainly to pacify their mounts and comfort the madly frightened girl. It was plain that no army of mortal men had beleaguered them, for the noises still changed from instant to instant, and they heard a most evil howling and a roaring as of hell-born beasts that deafened them with its volume. Naught, however, was visible in the gloom, whose circle now began to move swiftly, without widening or contracting. To maintain their position in its center, the warriors and their charges were compelled to leave the path and to flee northwardly amid the harsh ridges and hollows. All around them the baleful noises continued, keeping, as it seemed, the same interval of distance. The sun, slanting westward, no longer shone into that eerily moving pit, and a deep twilight enveloped the wanderers. Zobal and Kushara rode as closely beside Rubalsa as the rough ground permitted, straining their eyes constantly for any visible sign of the cohorts that seemed to encompass them. Both were filled with the darkest misgivings, for it had become all too manifest that supernatural powers were driving them astray into untracked desert. Moment by moment, the gross darkness seemed to close in, and there was a palpable eddying and seething as of monstrous forms behind its curtain. The horses stumbled over boulders and outcroppings of ore-sharp stone, and the grievously burdened asses were compelled to put forth an unheard-of speed to keep pace with the ever-shifting circle that menaced them with its horrid clamor. Rubalsa had ceased her outcries, as if overcome by exhaustion or resignation to the horror of her plight, and the shrill screeches of the eunuch had subsided into fearful wheezing and gasping. Ever and anon it seemed that great fiery eyes glared out of the gloom, floating close to earth or moving aloft at a gigantic height. Zobal began to shoot his enchanted arrows at these appearances, and the speeding of each bolt was hailed by an appalling outburst of satanic laughters and ululations. In such wise they went on, losing all measure of time and sense of orientation. The animals were galled and footsore. Simban was nigh dead from fright and fatigue. Rubalsa drooped in her saddle, and the warriors, awed and baffled by the predicament in which their weapons appeared useless, began to flag with a dull weariness. "Never again shall I doubt the legendary of Israel," said Kushara gloomily. "It is in my mind that we have not long either to doubt or believe," rejoined Zobal. To add to their distress, the terrain grew rougher and steeper, and they climbed acclivitous hillsides and went down endlessly into drear valleys. Anon they came to a flat, open, pebbly space. There, all at once, it seemed that the pandemonium of evil noises drew back on every hand, receding and fading into faint, dubious whispers that died at a vast remove. Simultaneously, the circling night thinned out, and a few stars shone in the welkin, and the sharp-spined hills of the desert loomed starkly against a vermilion afterglow. The travelers paused and peered wonderingly at one another, in a gloom that was no more than that of natural twilight. "What new devilry is this?" asked Kushara, hardly daring to believe that the hellish leaguers had vanished. "I know not," said the archer, who was staring into the dusk, "but here, mayhap, is one of the devils." The others now saw that a muffled figure was approaching them, bearing a lit lantern made of some kind of translucent horn. At some distance behind the figure, lights appeared suddenly in a square dark mass which none of the party had discerned before. This mass was evidently a large building with many windows. The figure, drawing near, was revealed by the dim yellowish lantern as a black man of immense girth and tallness, garbed in a voluminous robe of saffron, such as was worn by certain monkish orders, and crowned with the two-horned purple hat of an abbot. He was indeed a singular and unlooked-for apparition, for if any monasteries existed amid the barren reaches of Israel, they were hidden and unknown to the world. Zobal, however, searching his memory, recalled a vague tradition he had once heard concerning a chapter of Negro monks that had flourished in Euros many centuries ago. The chapter had long been extinct, and the very site of its monastery was forgotten. Nowadays there were few blacks anywhere in the kingdom, other than those who did duty as eunuchs guarding the seraglios of nobles and rich merchants. The animals began to display a certain uneasiness at the stranger's approach. "Who art thou?" challenged Kushara, his fingers tightening on the haft of his weapon. The black man grinned capaciously, showing great rows of discolored teeth, whose incisors were like those of a wild dog. His enormous, unctuous jowls were creased by the grin into folds of amazing number and volume, and his eyes, deeply slanted and close together, seemed to wink perpetually in pouches that shook like ebon jellies. His nostrils flared prodigiously, his purple, blubbery lips drooled and quivered, and he licked them with a fat, red, salacious tongue before replying to Kushara's question. "I am Ujuk, abbot of the monastery of Puthuum," he said in a thick voice of such extraordinary volume that it appeared almost to issue from the earth under his feet. "Methinks the night has overtaken you far from the route of travelers. I bid you welcome to our hospitality." "Aye, the night took us betimes," Kushara returned dryly. Neither he nor Zobal was reassured by the look of lust in the abbot's obscenely twinkling eyes as he peered at Rubalsa. Moreover, they had now noted the excessive and disagreeable length of the dark nails on his huge hands and bare, splayed feet, nails that were curving 3-inch talons, sharp as those of some beast or bird of prey. It seemed, however, that Rubalsa and Simban were less abhorrently impressed, or had not noticed these details, for both made haste to acknowledge the abbot's proffer of hospitality, and to urge acceptance upon the visibly reluctant warriors. To this urging Zobal and Kushara yielded, both inwardly resolving to keep a close watch on all the actions and movements of the abbot of Puthuum. Ujuk, holding the horn lantern aloft, conducted the travelers to that massive building, whose lights they had discerned at no great distance. A ponderous gate of dark wood swung open silently at their approach, and they entered a spacious courtyard, cobbled with worn, greasy-looking stones, and dimly illumined by torches in rusty iron sockets. Several monks appeared with startling suddenness before the travelers, who had thought the courtyard vacant at first glance. They were all of unusual bulk and stature, and their features possessed an extraordinary likeness to those of Ujuk, from whom, indeed, they could hardly have been distinguished, save by the yellow cowls which they wore in lieu of the abbot's horned purple hat. The similarity extended even to their curved and talon-like nails of inordinate length. Their movements were phantasmally furtive and silent. Without speaking, they took charge of the horses and asses. Kushara and Zobal relinquished their mounts to the care of these doubtful hostlers with the reluctance which, apparently, was not shared by Rupalsa or the eunuch. The monks also signified a willingness to relieve Kushara of his heavy pike, and Zobal of his ironwood bow and half-emptied quiver of ensorcelled arrows. But at this the warriors balked, refusing to let the weapons pass from their possession. Ujuk led them to an inner portal which gave admission to the refectory. It was a large, low room lit by brazen lamps of antique workmanship, such as ghouls might have recovered from a desert-sunken tomb. The abbot, with ogre-like grinnings, besought his guests to take their place at a long, massive table of ebony, with chairs and benches of the same material. When they had seated themselves, Ujuk sat down at the table's head. Immediately 4 monks came in, bearing platters piled with spicily smoking viands, and deep earthen flagons, full of a dark amber-brown liquor. And these monks, like those encountered in the courtyard, were gross ebon-black simulacra of their abbot, resembling him precisely in every feature and member. Zobal and Kushara were chary of tasting the liquor, which, for its odor, appeared to be an exceptionally potent kind of ale. For their doubts concerning Ujuk and his monastery grew graver every moment. Also, in spite of their hunger, they refrained from the food set before them, which consisted mainly of baked meats that neither could identify. Simban and Rupalsa, however, addressed themselves promptly to the meal with appetites sharpened by the long fasting and the weird fatigues of the day. The warriors observed that neither food nor drink had been placed before Ujuk, and they conjectured that he had already dined. To their growing disgust and anger, he sat lolling obesely, with lustful eyes upon Rupalsa, in a stare broken only by the nictitations that accompanied his perpetual grinning. This stare soon began to abash the girl, and then to alarm and frighten her. She ceased eating, and Simban, who had been deeply preoccupied till then with his supper, was plainly perturbed when he saw the flagging of her appetite. He seemed, for the first time, to notice the abbot's unmonastic leering, and showed his disapproval by sundry horrible grimaces. He also remarked pointedly, in a loud, piercing voice, that the girl was destined for the harem of King Hoaraph. But at this, Ujuk merely chuckled, as if Simban had uttered some exquisitely humorous jest. Zobal and Kushara were hard put to repress their wrath, and both itched hotly for the fleshing of their weapons in the abbot's gross bulk. He, however, seemed to have taken Simban's hint, for he shifted his gaze from the girl. Instead, he began to eye the warriors with a curious and loathsome avidity, which they found little less insupportable than his ogling of Rupalsa. The well-nourished eunuch also came in for his share of Ujuk's regard, which seemed to have in it the hunger of a hyena gloating over his prospective prey. Simban, obviously ill at ease and somewhat frightened, now tried to carry on a conversation with the abbot, volunteering much information as to himself, his companions, and the adventures which had brought them to Puthuum. Ujuk seemed little surprised by this information, and Zobal and Kushara, who took no part in the conversation, became surer than ever that he was no true abbot. "How far have we gone astray from the route to Farad?" asked Simban. "I do not consider that you have gone astray," rumbled Ujuk in a subterranean voice, "for your coming to Puthuum is most timely. We have few guests here, and we are loth to part with those who honor our hospitality." "King Hoaraph will be impatient for our return with the girl," Simban quavered. "We must depart early tomorrow." "Tomorrow is another matter," said Ujuk in a tone half unctuous, half sinister. "Perhaps by then you will have forgotten this deplorable haste." Little was said during the rest of the meal, and indeed little was drunk or eaten, for even Simban seemed to have lost his normally voracious appetite. Ujuk, still grinning as if at some uproarious jest known only to himself, was apparently not concerned with the urging of food upon his guests. Certain of the monks came and went unbidden, removing the laden dishes, and as they departed, Zobal and Kushara perceived a strange thing, for no shadows were cast by the monks on the lamp-lit floor beside the moving adumbrations of the vessels they carried. From Ujuk, however, a heavy, misshapen umbrage fell and lay like a prone incubus beside his chair. "Methinks we have come to a hatching-place of demons," whispered Zobal to Kushara. "We have fought many men, thou and I, but never such as wanted wholesome shadows." "Aye," muttered the pike-bearer, "but I like this abbot even less than his monks, though he alone is the caster of a shade." Ujuk now rose from his seat, saying, "I trow that ye are all weary, and would sleep betimes." Rubalsa and Simban, who had both drunk a certain amount of the powerful ale of Puthuum, nodded a drowsy assent. Zobal and Kushara, noting their premature sleepiness, were glad they had declined the liquor. The abbot led his guests along a corridor, whose gloom was but little relieved by the flaring of torches in a strong draught that blew stealthily from an undetermined source, causing a rout of wild shadows to flitter beside the passers. On either hand there were cells with portals shut only by hangings of a coarse hempen fabric. The monks had all vanished. The cells were seemingly dark, and an air of age-old desolation pervaded the monastery, together with the smell as of moldering bones piled in some secret catacomb. Midway in the hall, Ujuk paused and held aside the arras of a doorway that differed in no wise from the rest. Within, a lamp burned, depending from an archaic chain of curiously linked and fretted metal. The room was bare but spacious, and a bed of ebony with opulent quiltings of an olden fashion stood by the farther wall under an open window. This chamber, the abbot indicated, was for the occupancy of Rubalsa, and he then offered to show the men and the eunuch their respective quarters. Simban, seeming to wake all at once from his drowsiness, protested at the idea of being separated in such wise from his charge. As if Ujuk had been prepared for this, and had given orders accordingly, a monk appeared forthwith, bringing quilts which he laid on the flagged floor within the portals of Rubalsa's room. Simban stretched himself promptly on the improvised bed, and the warriors withdrew with Ujuk. "Come," said the abbot, his wolfish teeth gleaming in the torchlight. "Ye will sleep soundly in the beds I have prepared." Zobal and Kushara, however, had now assumed the position of guardsmen outside the doorway of Rubalsa's chamber. They told Ujuk curtly that they were responsible to King Hoaraph for the girl's safety and must watch over her at all times. "I wish ye a pleasant vigil," said Ujuk, with a cachinnation like the laughter of hyenas in some underground tomb. With his departure, It seemed that the black slumber of a dead antiquity settled upon all the building. Rubalsa and Simban, apparently, slept without stirring, for there was no sound from behind the hempen arras. The warriors spoke only in whispers, lest they should arouse the girl. Their weapons held ready for instant use, they watched the shadowy hall with a jealous vigilance, for they did not trust the quietude about them, being well assured that a host of foul cacodemons couched somewhere behind it, biding the time of assault. Howbeit, nothing occurred to reconfirm them in such apprehensions. The draught that breathed furtively along the hall seemed to tell only of age-forgotten death and cyclic solitude. The two began to perceive signs of dilapidation in walls and floor that had heretofore escaped their notice. Eerie, fantastical thoughts came to them with insidious persuasion. It seemed that the building was a ruin that had lain uninhabited for 1,000 years, that the black Abbot Ujuk and his shadowless monks were mere imaginations, things that had never been, that the moving circle of darkness, the pandemonian voices that had herded them toward Puthuum, were no more than a daymare whose memory was now fading in the fashion of dreams. Thirst and hunger troubled them, for they had not eaten since early morn, and had snatched only a few hasty draughts of wine or water during the day. Both, however, began to feel the on-creeping of a sleepy hebetude, which, under the circumstance, was most undesirable. They nodded, started, and awoke recurrently to their peril. But still, like a siren voice in poppy dreams, the silence seemed to tell them that all danger was a bygone thing, an illusion that belonged to yesterday. Several hours passed, and the hall lightened with the rising of a late moon that shone through a window at its eastern end. Zobal, less bedrowsed than Kushara, was awakened to full awareness by a sudden commotion among the animals in the courtyard without. There were loud neighings that rose to a frenzied pitch, as if something had frightened the horses, and to these the asses began to add their heavy braying, till Kushara was also aroused. "Make sure that thou drowsest not again," Zobel admonished the pike-bearer. "I shall go forth and inquire as to the cause of this tumult." "'Tis a good thought," commended Kushara, "and while thou art gone, see to it that none has molested our provisions, and bring back with thee some apricots and cakes of sesame and a skin of ruby red wine." The monastery itself remained silent as Zobal went down the hall, his buskins of link-covered leather ringing faintly. At the hall's end, an outer door stood open, and he passed through it into the courtyard. Even as he emerged, the animals ceased their clamor. He could see but dimly, for all the torches in the courtyard, save one, had burnt out or been extinguished, and the low gibbous moon had not yet climbed the wall. Nothing, to all appearance, was amiss. The two asses were standing quietly beside the mountainous piles of provisions and saddlebags they had borne. The horses seemed to drowse amicably in a group. Zobel decided that perhaps there had been some temporary bickering between his stallion and Kushara's mare. He went forward to make sure that there was no other cause of disturbance. Afterward, he turned to the wineskins, intending to refresh himself before rejoining Kushara with a supply of drinkables and comestibles. Hardly had he washed the dust of Israel from his throat with a long draught, when he heard an eerie, dry whispering, whose source and distance he could not at once determine. Sometimes it seemed at his very ear, and then it ebbed away, as if sinking into profound subterranean vaults. But the sound, though variable in this manner, never ceased entirely, and it seemed to shape itself into words that the listener almost understood, words that were fraught with the hopeless sorrow of a dead man who had sinned long ago and had repented his sin through black sepulchral ages. As he hearkened to the sear anguish of that sound, the hair bristled on the archer's neck, and he knew such fear as he had never known in the thick of battle. And yet, at the same time, he was aware of deeper pity than the pain of dying comrades had ever aroused in his heart, and it seemed that the voice implored him for commiseration and succor, laying upon him a weird compulsion that he dared not disobey. He could not wholly comprehend the things that the whisperer besought him to do, but somehow he must ease that desolate anguish. Still the whispering rose and fell, and Zobal forgot that he had left Kushara to a lone vigil beset with hellish dangers, forgot that the voice itself might well be only a device of demons to lure him astray. He began to search the courtyard, his keen ears alert for the source of the sound, and after some dubitation he decided that it issued from the ground in a corner opposite the gateway. Here, amid the cobbling, in the wall's angle, he found a large slab of syenite, with a rusty metal ring in its center. He was quickly confirmed in his decision, for the whispering became louder and more articulate, and he thought that it said to him, "Lift the slab." The archer grasped the rusty ring with both hands, and putting forth all his strength, he succeeded in tilting back the stone, albeit not without such exertion as made him feel that his very spine would crack. A dark opening was exposed, and from it surged a charnel stench so overpowering that Zobal turned his face away and was like to have vomited. But the whisper came with a sharp, woeful beseeching out of the darkness below, and it said to him, "Descend." Zobal wrenched from its socket the one torch that still burned in the courtyard. By its lurid flaring, he saw a flight of worn steps that went down into the reeking sepulchral gloom, and resolutely he descended the steps, finding himself at their bottom in a hewn vault with deep shelves of stone on either hand. The shelves, running away into darkness, were piled with human bones and mummified bodies, and plainly the place was the catacomb of the monastery. The whispering had ceased, and Zobal peered about him in bewilderment not unmixed with horror. "I am here," resumed the dry, susurrus voice, issuing from amid the heaps of mortal remnants on the shelf close beside him. Startled, and feeling again that crisping of the hairs on his neck, Zobal held his torch to the low shelf as he looked for the speaker. In a narrow niche between stacks of disarticulated bones, he beheld a half-decayed corpse, about whose long, attenuate limbs and hollow body there clung a few rotten shreds of yellow cloth. These, he thought, were the remnants of a robe, such as worn by the monks of Puthuum. Then, thrusting his torch into the niche, he discerned the lean, mummy-like head, on which mouldered a thing that had once been the horned hat of an abbot. The corpse was black as ebony, and plainly it was that of a great negro. It bore an aspect of incredible age, as if it had lain there for centuries. But from it came the odor of newly ripe corruption that had sickened Zobal when he lifted the slab of syenite. As he stood staring down, it seemed to Zobal that the cadaver stirred a little, as if fain to rise from its recumbent posture, and he saw a gleaming as of eyeballs in the deep-shadowed sockets, and the dolorously curling lips were retracted still farther, and from between the bared teeth there issued that awful whispering which had drawn him into the catacomb. "Listen closely," said the whispering. "There is much for me to tell thee, and much for thee to do when the telling is done. I am Oldor, the abbot of Puthuum. More than 1,000 years ago, I came with my monks to Euros from Ilkar, the Black Empire of the North. The Emperor of Ilkar had driven us forth, for our cult of celibacy, our worship of the maiden goddess Ojal, were hateful to him. Here, amid the desert of Isdrel, we built our monastery and dwelt unmolested. We were many in number at first, but the years went by, and one by one the brothers were laid in the catacomb we had delved for our resting place. They died with none to replace them. I alone survived in the end, for I had won such sanctity as ensures longevous days, and had also become a master of the arts of sorcery. Time was a demon that I held at bay, like one who stands in a charmed circle. My powers were still hale and unimpaired, and I lived on as an anchorite in the monastery. At first the solitude was far from irksome for me, and I was wholly absorbed in my study of the arcana of nature. But after a time it seemed that such things no longer sufficed. I grew aware of my loneliness, and was much beset by the demons of the waste, who had troubled me little heretofore. Succubi, fair but baneful, Lamia, with the round, soft bodies of women, came to tempt me in the drear vigils of the night. I resisted, but there was one she-devil, more cunning than the others, who crept into my cell in the semblance of a girl I had loved long ago, ere yet I had taken the vows of Ojal. To her I succumbed, and of that unholy union was born the half-human fiend, Ujuk, who has since called himself the Abbot of Puthuum. After that sin I wished to die, and the wish was manifoldly strengthened when I beheld the progeny of the sin. Too greatly, however, I had offended Ojal, and a frightful penance was decreed for me. I lived, and daily I was plagued and persecuted by the monster Ujuk, who grew lustily in the manner of such offspring. But when Ujuk had gained his full stature, there came upon me such weakness and decrepitude as made me hopeful of death. Scarce could I stir in my impotence, and Ujuk, taking advantage of this, bore me in his horrid arms to the catacomb, and laid me among the dead. Here I have remained ever since, dying and rotting eternally, and yet eternally alive. For almost a millennium I have suffered unsleepingly the dire anguish of repentance that brings no expiation. Through the powers of saintly and sorcerous vision that never left me, I was doomed to watch the foul deeds, the hell-dark iniquities of Ujuk. Wearing the guise of an abbot, endowed with strange infernal powers, together with a kind of immortality, he has presided over Puthuum through the centuries. His enchantments have kept the monastery hidden, save from those that he wishes to draw within reach of his ghoulish hunger, his incubus-like desires. Men he devours, and women are made to serve his lust, and still I am condemned to see his turpitudes, and the seeing is my most grievous punishment. The whisper sank away, and Zobal, who had listened in eldritch awe, as one who hears the speech of a dead man, was doubtful for a moment that Uldor still lived. Then the seer voice went on. Archer, I crave a boon from thee, and I offer in return a thing that will aid thee against Ujuk. In thy quiver thou bearest charmed arrows, and the wizardry of him that wrought them was good. Such arrows can slay the else immortal powers of evil. They can slay Ujuk, and even such evil as endures in me and forbids me to die. Archer, grant me an arrow through the heart, and if that suffice not, an arrow through the right eye, and one through the left, and leave the arrows in their mark, for I deem that thou canst well spare so many. One alone is needed for Ujuk, As to the monks thou hast seen, I will tell thee a secret. They are 12 in number, but... Zobal would scarcely have believed the thing that Uldor now unfolded, if the events of the day had not left him beyond all incredulity. The abbot continued, When I am wholly dead, take thou the talisman which depends about my neck. The talisman is a touchstone that will dissolve such ill enchantments as have a material seeming, if applied thereto with the hand. For the first time, Zobal perceived the talisman, which was an oval of plain grey stone lying upon Uldor's withered bosom on a chain of black silver. Make haste, O archer, the whispering implored. Zobal had socketed his torch in a pile of mouldering bones beside Uldor. With a sense of mingled compulsion and reluctance, he drew an arrow from his quiver, notched it, and aimed unflinchingly down at Uldor's heart. The shaft went straightly and deeply into its mark, and Zobal waited. But anon from the retracted lips of the black abbot there issued a faint murmuring. Archer, another arrow. Again the bow was drawn, and the shaft sped unerringly into the hollow orbit of Uldor's right eye, and again, after an interval, there came the almost inaudible pleading, Archer, still another shaft. Once more the bow of ironwood sang in the silent vault, and an arrow stood in the left eye of Uldor, quivering with the force of its propulsion. This time there was no whisper from the rotting lips, but Zobal heard a curious rustling and a sigh as of lapsing sand. Beneath his gaze the black limbs and body crumbled swiftly, the face and head fell in, and the 3 arrows sagged awry, since there was not now but a pile of dust and parting bones to hold them embedded. Leaving the arrows as Uldor had enjoined him to do, Zobal groped for the grey talisman that was now buried amid those fallen relics. Finding it, he hung it carefully at his belt, beside the long straight sword which he carried. Perhaps, he reflected, the thing might have its use ere the night was over. Quickly he turned away and climbed the steps to the courtyard. A saffron-yellow and lopsided moon was soaring above the wall, and he knew by this that he had been absent overlong from his vigil with Kushara. All, however, seemed tranquil. The drowsing animals had not stirred, and the monastery was dark and soundless. Seizing a full wineskin and a bag containing such edibles as Kushara had asked him to bring, Zobal hurried back to the open hall. Even as he passed into the building, the Aris-like silence before him was burst asunder by a frightful hubbub. He distinguished amid the clamour the screaming of Rubalsa, the screeching of Simban, and the furious roaring of Kushara. But above these, as if to drown them all, an obscene laughter mounted continually, like the welling forth of dark subterranean waters, thick and foul with the fats of corruption. Zobal dropped the wineskin and the sack of comestibles, and raced forward, unslinging his bow as he went. The outcries of his companions continued, but he heard them faintly now above the damnable incubus-like laughter that swelled as if to fill the whole monastery. As he neared the space before Rubalsa's chamber, he saw Kushara beating with a haft of his pike at a blank wall in which there was no longer a hempen-curtained doorway. Behind the wall, the screeching of Simban ceased in a gurgling moan like that of some butchered steer. But the girl's terror-sharpened cries still mounted through the smothering cachinnation. "This wall was wrought by demons!" raged the pike-bearer as he smote vainly at the smooth masonry. "I kept a faithful watch, but they built it behind me in a silence as of the dead, and a fouler work is being done in that chamber." "Master thy frenzy," said Zobal, as he strove to regain the command of his own faculties amid the madness that threatened to overwhelm him. At that instant he recalled the oval grey touchstone of Uldor, which hung at his baldric from its black silver chain, and it came to him that the closed wall was perhaps an unreal enchantment, against which the talisman might serve even as Uldor had said. Quickly he took the touchstone in his fingers and held it to the blank surface where the doorway had been. Kushara looked on with an air of stupefaction, as if deeming the archer demented. But even as the talisman clicked faintly against it, the wall seemed to dissolve, leaving only a rude arras that fell away in tatters, as if it too had been no more than a sorcerous illusion. The strange disintegration continued to spread. The whole partition melted away to a few warm blocks, and the gibbous moon shone in as the Abbey of Puthuum crumbled silently to a gapped and roofless ruin. All this had occurred in a few moments, but the warriors found no room for wonder. By the livid light of the moon, which peered down like the face of a worm-gnawed cadaver, they looked upon a scene so hideous that it caused them to forget all else. Before them, on a cracked floor from whose interstices grew desert grasses, the eunuch Simban laid sprawled in death. His raiment was torn to streamers, and blood bubbled darkly from his mangled throat. Even the leather pouches which he bore at his girdle had been ripped open, and gold coins, vials of medicine, and other oddments were scattered around him. Beyond, by the half-crumbled outer wall, Rubalsa lay in a litter of rotted cloth and woodwork, which had been the gorgeously quilted ebon bed. She was trying to fend off with her lifted hands the enormously swollen shape that hung horizontally above her, as if levitated by the floating wing-like folds of its saffron robe. This shape the warriors recognized as the Abbot Ujuk. The overwhelming laughter of the black incubus had ceased, and he turned upon the intruders a face contorted by diabolic lust and fury. His teeth clashed audibly, his eyes glowed in their pouches like beads of red-hot metal as he withdrew from his position over the girl and loomed monstrously erect before her amid the ruins of the chamber. Kushara rushed forward with leveled pike ere Zobel could fit one of his arrows to the string. But even as the pike-bearer crossed the sill, it seemed that the foully bloated form of Ujuk multiplied itself in a dozen yellow-garmented shapes that surged to meet Kushara's onset. Appearing as if by some hellish legerdemain, the monks of Puthuum had mustered to assist their abbot. Zobel cried out in warning, but the shapes were all about Kushara, dodging the thrusts of his weapon and clawing ferociously at his plate armor with their terrific 3-inch talons. Valiantly he fought them, only to go down after a little and disappear from sight as if whelmed by a pack of ravening hyenas. Remembering the scarce credible thing that Uldor had told them, Zobel wasted no arrows upon the monks. His bow ready, he waited for full sight of Ujuk, beyond the seething rout that wrangled malignantly back and forth above the fallen pike-bearer. In an eddying of the pack, he aimed swiftly at the looming incubus, who seemed wholly intent on that fiendish struggle, as if directing it in some wise without spoken word or ponderable gesture. Straight and true the arrow sped with an exultant singing, and good was the sorcery of Amdok who had wrought it, for Ujuk reeled and went down, his horrid fingers tearing vainly at the shaft that was driven nigh to its fledging of eagle quills in his body. Now a strange thing occurred, for as the incubus fell and writhed to and fro in his dying, the 12 monks all dropped away from Kushara, tossing convulsively on the floor as if they were but shaken shadows of the thing that died. It seemed to Zobel that their forms grew dim and diaphanous, and he saw the cracks in the flagstones beyond them, and the writhings lessened with those of Ujuk. And when Ujuk lay still at last, the faint outlines of the figures vanished, as if erased from earth and air. Naught remained but the noisome bulk of that fiend who had been the progeny of the Abbot Uldor and the Lamia. But the bulk shrank visibly from instant to instant beneath its sagging garments, and a smell of ripe corruption arose, as if all that was human in the hellish thing were rotting swiftly away. Kushara had scrambled to his feet and was peering about in a stunned fashion. His heavy armor had saved him from the talons of his assailants, but the armor itself was scored from greaves to helmet with innumerable scratches. "Whither have the monks gone?" he inquired. "They were all about me an instant ago, like so many wild dogs, worrying a fallen aurochs." "The monks were but emanations of Ujuk," said Zobal. "They were mere phantasms, multiple idola, that he sent forth and withdrew into himself at will, and they had no real existence apart from him. With Ujuk's death, they have become less than shadows." "Verily, such things are prodigious," opined the pike-bearer. The warriors now turned their attention to Repulsa, who had struggled to a sitting posture amid the downfallen wreckage of her bed. The tatters of rotting quilting, which she clutched about her with shameful fingers at their approach, served but little to conceal her well-rounded ivory nakedness. She wore an air of mingled fright and confusion, like a sleeper who has just awakened from some atrocious nightmare. "Had the incubus harmed thee?" inquired Zobel anxiously. He was reassured by her faint, bewildered negative. Dropping his eyes before the piteous disarray of her girlish beauty, he felt in his heart a deeper enamorment than before, a passion touched with such tenderness as he had never known in the hot, brief loves of his hazard-haunted days. Eyeing Kushara covertly, he knew with dismay that this emotion was shared to the fullest by his comrade. The warriors now withdrew to a little distance and turned their backs decorously while Rubalsa dressed. "I deem," said Zobal, in a low voice beyond overhearing of the girl, "that thou and I tonight have met and conquered such perils as were not contracted for in our service to Hoaraph, and I deem that we are of one mind concerning the maiden, and love her too dearly now to deliver her to the captious lust of a sated king. Therefore we cannot return to Farad. If it please thee, we shall draw lots for the girl, and the loser will attend the winner as a true comrade, till such time as we have made our way from Israel and have crossed the border of some land lying beyond Horaph's rule." To this Kushara agreed. When Rubalsa had finished her dressing, the two began to look about them for such objects as might serve in the proposed sortilege. Kushara would have tossed one of the golden coins, stamped with Horaph's image, which had rolled from Simban's torn money-bag. But Zobal shook his head at the suggestion, having espied certain items which he thought even more exquisitely appropriate than the coin. These objects were the talons of the Incubus, whose corpse had now dwindled in size and was horribly decayed, with a hideous wrinkling of the whole head and an actual shortening of the members. In this process, the claws of hands and feet had all dropped away and were lying loose on the pavement. Removing his helmet, Zobel stooped down and placed within it the 5 hellish-looking talons of the right hand, among which that of the index finger was the longest. He shook the helmet vigorously as one shakes a dice-box, and there was a sharp clattering from the claws. Then he held the helmet out to Kushara, saying, "He who draws the forefinger talon shall take the girl." Kushara put in his hand and withdrew it quickly, holding aloft the heavy thumbnail, which was the shortest of all. Zobal drew the nail of the middle finger, and Kushara, at his second trial, brought forth the little finger's claw. Then, to the deep chagrin of the pike-bearer, Zobal produced the dearly coveted index talon. Rubalsa, who had been watching this singular procedure with open curiosity, now said to the warriors, "What are you doing?" Zobal started to explain, but before he had finished, the girl cried out indignantly, "Neither of ye has consulted my preference in this matter." Then, pouting prettily, she turned away from the disconcerted archer and flung her arms about the neck of Kushara.